Welcome to Subcreation, the podcast that seeks and finds the divine in art, story, even muscle cars, and everything in between. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me. This is our inaugural podcast, Subcreation, finding the divine in art, story, and even muscle cars, and everything in between. I'm Dr. Troy Hinkel, and I am your host, and it's good to be with you. This word subcreation, actually take that word from an essay that I read by one of my favorite authors, an author named J.R.R. Tolkien, the same author who wrote The Lord of the Rings. Yes, it was a book series before it was a movie. And he wrote this essay called On Fairy Tales. And he was defending the whole idea or the concept of fairy tales, indeed of fantasy. And he came up with this word that I like, subcreation. And he means by this word that it's a world that a creature makes that is not the world God made, which he calls the primary world, but nevertheless shares in that world in certain ways and doesn't share in that world in certain ways. And so in this essay, he explains how it shares and how it doesn't. You can read the essay if you wish. I simply liked the word, and I liked the concept, subcreation, and the connection between the subcreated world and the primary world, and the connection being the very law of creation that God has put in his creation. You could say he thought it all out first before he enacted it. And so a subcreator wants to think out his or her art or story or architecture or muscle car or invention or whatever before he or she creates. And to me, that's interesting. And so the interest and what I find interesting is the purpose of this podcast. I want to look in these sub-creations and I want to find what's interesting and I want to share it with you because I think this is how we think about the world differently. This is how we grow. This is how we ourselves are enhanced. So when we look at sub-creations, we are looking for something that strikes us, that teaches us, maybe through analogy, some kind of parallel, some kind of simile, analogy between that world and this one. And something Tolkien mentions when he's talking about his worlds and fantasy is this presence of good and evil, this presence of peril or danger and the need to sacrifice for victory, and ultimately the success of the good over the evil. And he argues that if those are missing or if they're confused or subverted, then the story doesn't work. And I've seen and read perfect examples of this. Like I remember reading a story in college where it was written by a person whose whole argument is there is no meaning to the world. Why he wrote a story about it, I don't know. That seemed to imply he thinks there is a meaning, but maybe for him the meaning was there was no meaning. And in the story, one of the characters simply takes a pea and moves it from one spoon to the other spoon, from one spoon back to the other spoon, and that's it. And his whole point was, all we do is occupy our time with meaningless things. I thought, okay, then why am I reading this? And I don't think I ever finished the story. Okay, so to me, I agree with Tolkien. That doesn't work. We want to see what is interesting, what engages me, what draws me in, what helps me discover myself in that world. You know, there's a word, enchantment, and you hear this word a lot. Think of what it literally means. En, to enter into, chant, the harmony, the song, if you will, the orchestra that starts from the conductor and includes the instruments in his symphony. And to be enchanted means I recognize myself in this harmony. And for me to be able to create another world or piece of art or music or a car or an airplane or anything else invented that's interesting means that I myself have been given creative gifts, and this is how I share in the life of the Creator himself. And this makes it interesting. It's quite different than how I think most people think of God as a master who simply wants to take our freedom. On the contrary, this concept reveals he's given us our freedom and our creativity for a reason. And he's given us the freedom to decide how we're going to subcreate. We're not limited by good and evil, because evil is merely a loss or a privation of the good that is supposed to be there. So I don't want to be harmed. I don't want to be diminished and call that wrong. That's all that's saying is evil limits me. And so if I don't want to be limited, then I need to discover what my freedom is for and my creativity, and use it wisely and use it well. I remember when I was probably 5th grade, we actually combined 2 classes and there was no actual wall between the two. And the teachers decided after lunch, a good time to make this decision, they wanted to help the children, us, enter into what we needed to do after lunch and recess. And they thought, let's read a story together with both classes. It's good for the kids to hear story told. What story shall we read? And they read this book I'd never heard of. It was called The Hobbit. It was recently republished. It had been published, I think, back in the 40s, maybe 50s, and republished in the early 70s, and reinvigorated interest. So this is just a few years later, and my teacher, Miss Perry, read it to a spellbound audience, me included. As I sat and listened, as my classmates sat and listened. Remember, this is after lunch, after recess. When you either want a nap or you want to stay out playing, you certainly don't want to sit down and do math. And they knew this. It didn't take long as she read this story for us all to be enchanted, for us to enter in, for us to experience a sub-created world Tolkien named Middle Earth. You can see the resemblance between how he named that world in his fiction and this whole idea of subcreation. Well, as she told the story, and it included dwarves and elves and hobbits and goblins and trolls and dragons and everything in between, jungles, or at least deep, dark forests and enchanted waters that put you to sleep, and magic rings and swords that turn blue. I could see all of that because all of those things exist in this world, but they exist in that world in a different way, but not in a way that challenges or rejects this world, but in a way that enhances things that we can find in this world. And it became a way for us, for me, to discover truths that maybe I took for granted or would have never seen. And this is what made me so spellbound. This is what I found the book so interesting. So guess what I asked for that year for Christmas? The entire set of Lord of the Rings, which I still have. Actually, my son has it, but it still exists. It's in family possession. And it's not in the best condition. I am not a 5th grader anymore, as you can tell. However, you can still read it. You can still open the pages and turn them and read them. And I see the pages I spent the most time on. Some pages I read and reread. Just recently, I reread The Hobbit after having not read it for decades. And I loved it. It's still my favorite book. When I reread it this time, I saw what I found to be maybe plot holes, or so I thought. And I was discussing these plot holes recently with a couple of my sons, and they actually argued with me. And they were showing me how maybe those plot holes, like, why would 13 elves and a hobbit think they could go attack a dragon and win when they're totally incompetent every step of the way? And that led to this interesting discussion. You know, they had Gandalf with them. He kind of put the whole thing together. He had a certain understanding of foresight into history. Thorin, the head elf, the head dwarf, he wanted to regain his lost land, his lost name, his lost wealth before he died. And the dwarves that were with him wanted to do the same. They were kind of down and out. They had nothing to lose. Well, okay, I could buy that, I suppose. I could also buy the fact that when you're greedy, your mind goes out the window and just your lust for power or fame or money, that's all that drives you. I get that too. The point is, the world that Tolkien created, Middle Earth, he did such a good job that even when my critical mind as an adult was trying to kick in ways it never did as a youth, I still found the story believable. And Tolkien himself said, I'm not trying to create a seamless, different world, one that is just as well thought out. That's the whole idea behind subcreation. That word sub means under. It's underneath the law of creation that's already been established. But rather, as a creator, you want to do the best job that you can at your fantasy, to draw parallels and analogies to the real world so we can discover truths, goodnesses, psychological meaning, moral tale that help me find relevance in my life now. And a good author knows how to do that in enough way that we at least can set aside our critical thinking. It's believable enough for us to truly enter in. And I think that's the key. And this is what I want to look at, because I think there's all kinds of creators who've done this. This is why my interests are so vast, and why the title is covering art, story, muscle cars, and everything in between, like music or like airplanes or whatever. Because in every case, when we see people creating something that works, they don't see the world around them as a limitation of what they're trying to accomplish, but rather it's precisely what helps them accomplish it. For instance, if I'm an architect and I'm designing a building, I'm not going to look at the laws of physics and the need to have right angles in my building as a limitation, because if I do, I'm going to design a building that's going to collapse. Rather, I see those as ways of helping shape my creative freedom so that I design something that works. Then from within that sandbox, I can build what I want. And then someone can come by and look and see and say, oh, okay, I see your castle. I see the moat. I see the drawbridge. Look, it even works. I can see your playground area, your courtyard, your steeples or your towers. Very interesting. And you can take some satisfaction in that, even when it's just you at 8 years old building it on the beach. This is what I'm looking for when we're looking at subcreation and finding the divine. How awesome it is that God, who's vast and beyond our understanding and retains this sense of mystery, nevertheless wants us to participate in him in that way. And so that's the whole point behind our title. You know, when we talk about why we find things interesting, one could say cynically, well, that's just your thing, meaning that's your taste. That's your opinion. And that's true. Might be my taste. It might be just my opinion. But leaving it at that leaves a very important unanswered question. Like, why is that my opinion? Why is that my taste? Just because I like it or feel good about it doesn't explain why I feel good about it or like it. There's something that has to undergird that forges and motivates my opinion or my taste. And that something is goodness itself, or beauty, or truth. Plato called these the transcendentals, or maybe it was Aristotle, but he gets it from Plato. This idea that when we find something good or beautiful or truthful or unifying in this world, all we see are examples of it. We don't see the source. That is outside of this world, but allows itself to be imitated in this world. And when we find it, especially when we find it in a painstaking way, a kind of discovery, where maybe we're reading a story or looking at a piece of art for the fourth or fifth time we never looked at before in this newest way, and we discover something. Oh, I never noticed that before. That's interesting. Why is that? Because there's a detail in there that's bringing us into it and opening us up to a new horizon. And that detail is more than just taste or opinion. Rather, it shares in something perennial, something deeper, a deeper truth, a deeper goodness. The last time I went down to the art museum here where I live, I was looking at this piece of art, and this was a sacred piece of art. It was a picture, a painting of St. Francis of Assisi. And in the painting, St. Francis is looking at a crucifix, which is an image of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And he's looking at it, and while he's looking at it, you can see that he falls into a deep, almost trance, almost mystical relationship with the real thing by simply looking at the image. And of course, he's an image of the one true God. He's a creature. And here I am standing looking at the painting of him, looking at the crucifix, looking at Christ, who's the image of the Father incarnate. You see the layers of meaning that all get conveyed, and yet through and despite these layers, I myself had to admit I was entranced. I had this mystical connection. I stood there looking at that picture for a long time. It had all this meaning in it. And I'm sure if I went back and looked at it again, I'd find something even new. So this is the point we're looking at. This is why things are interesting. They're interesting because they point to truths that are stable and meaningful. That's why I have the taste for them. That's why I have the opinion for them. Then when I discover them, I can share that with another. That leads them to encounter that artwork, that story, that piece of music in a new way. And maybe they uncover something that you didn't see. And that's what makes for meaningful conversation. And then through that, you actually deepen your own friendship. You see how it works. True subcreation. It's an image of the real world, but it takes real world realities and respects them, and respects the medium. This is one of the things Tolkien mentions. It can't be preachy. You can't use the medium, disrespect it, because you want to give your message to your audience. Rather, you have to respect the medium and let your audience discover the messages for themselves. Maybe messages you didn't realize were there, but because of your intuition, your creativity, your genius, your own sense of observation, you put it in there and then someone else discovers it. That's pretty interesting too. So that's why we're doing this podcast. That's why I want to share what I find interesting with you. I hope as we look at these things together, we share the adventure. Maybe we uncover peril. Maybe we uncover victory. But this is how we ourselves are being drawn in through our own imagination, through our own ability to examine image and see how image bears resemblance to origin, to authorship, to originality. And in so doing, magnifies that and gives us new perspective. It's how we get enchanted. We enter into the harmony. It's how we ourselves, by sitting in an armchair, can go on an adventure. I love that line out of The Lord of the Rings. You never know what adventure you find when you simply walk down the end of out of your doorstep at the end of your sidewalk. Yeah, you never know how we get swept up. And that's the beauty of all of this, being swept up into a piece of music, swept up into a piece of art, swept up into examining how did this train, how did this plane, how did this automobile get designed? How do they do it so well? How did they figure out that an engine could have an internally combusting flame inside of it and turn that into energy that works to get us from point A to point B? These are subcreations. These are finding the divine. Well, I'm excited to share this with you. I'm excited to enter in and be enchanted with you, share these meanings, and hopefully enrich your life. You can bring this to your friendships, your conversations. In ensuing episodes, my next episode, I hope to look at fairy tales, because I think fairy tales are a good place to start when we're talking about these very things. I intend to look at the Pied Piper of Hamelin, short fairy tale. It originated maybe back in, some argue, the 12th or 13th centuries, before it was actually written down in the 1800s by the Grimm's brothers from Germany. And so it underwent variations. They captured the most original variation they knew, and they wrote that down, and then it's been rewritten many times since then. So we're going to look at that and see what's important there, what's interesting there, and what does that have to do with us. So I thank you for joining me. I look forward to being with you. Until next time, thank you.